Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of This is Revolution podcast. We have a very special episode today because we have some shout outs today because there's been some additions to the This is Revolution family. Jean Bajlan will not be joining us for a while because there's been another Bajlan. A little girl Bajlan was born yesterday. So give a shout out to Jean and his wife for the newest addition to the This is Revolution crew. So shout out to the Bajlans. Even shots fired because he's Kurdish and she's from Pakistan. So that's the way to celebrate. Cheers and with shots fired. Also, it is my mom's 64th birthday. So if you are watching, keep an eye out in the mail for a very special gift. And as we said last Saturday, it was the last show that I was doing in California. I'm now in Baja, California. And we're going to change the setup a little bit, but unfortunately you can't see. You'll see on the Saturday show because I'll probably try to do it outside. But right here off the coast in Baja, California. So that's pretty cool. So let me bring in my homie, my co-host, my dog, the man of the Mau Hour, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles in Mexico.
I'm in Mexico, and guess what? I found out that falling asleep in high school Spanish was a horrible idea. Horrible idea. Like, you think it's okay because you can get by, and then you find yourself living in Mexico. So I will be practicing some Spanish while I'm here.
Hit the YouTubes, buddy.
Yeah, isn't there one of those services that help you with that?
You can learn any language on YouTube.
Can I? You can like change your transmission, learn how to fix engine problems.
It's all there.
Pascal, can you talk to the people while I get the clip set up?
Not a problem. So, ladies and gents, welcome to tonight's episode of This is Revolution podcast. Tonight, we will have Matt McManus, and we'll be talking about liberalism, socialism, and conservatism and how they intertwine and affect each other politically and policy-wise. So we're going to have a good conversation discussing Matt's book in which he lays out his argument about the connection and or sometimes antagonisms between liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. So we're looking forward to that as well. So once again, also shout out to Jean Bajlan and his beautiful wife, Sarah, and congratulations on their newborn baby girl that was born today. I don't remember the exact time. She was a healthy sized baby too. I think it was 8 pounds, 13 ounces.
Yeah, the Bajlans, while not that tall, have giant chubsters. So shout out to Sarah's uterus. And on that note, let's play this clip.
Whites who are trying to solve the problem. You never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. The most deceitful. He's like a fox. And a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to. But the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling.
My philosophy is much more libertarianism than well, that's the fashionable word these days, I guess. A conservative is no longer just that. He's a libertarian. Always has been. Because how do we call a liberal? You know, someone very profoundly once said many years ago that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism. And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy? The conservative, so-called, is the one that says less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.
Until recently, to most Americans, the spectrum of legitimate political discourse revolved around two ideological poles: liberalism.
All right. Yes, that video ended pretty quick.
Radicalism of '68. Liberal emerged as a slur on the political right. Even the Democratic Party, the institutional manifestation of the left flank of capital, seemed to shy away from the term liberal, as the notion that the United States was fundamentally a center-right country came to be the naturalized common sense amongst the beltway establishment. However, with the development of a vocal, albeit political, feeble social democratic movement over the last 50 years, liberalism is facing challenges from the left. Indeed, today when someone utilizes the term lib in a derisive manner, it is often from the perspective that liberalism represents a rightist ideology. At the same time, elements of the conservative movement, in particular those who advocate free market orthodoxy and bloviate endlessly about phantasmic threats to free speech, have sought to recast themselves as classical liberals. Yet many Americans remain fundamentally ignorant of the complex historical relationship between liberalism and socialism. What is the relationship between these two ideological trends of the so-called left? How did these tendencies relate to one another historically? And are they mortal enemies or embittered kin? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
The labels liberal and conservative used to mean something fairly clear. A liberal used to mean somebody who believed in the individual, who believed in the free market, who believed that you should break down all the barriers toward individual self-expression. If this meant destroying the church or weakening the power of parents within their family, destroying social classes, all sorts of conventions, this is what liberals were in favor of. What conservatives were interested in doing were preserving a kind of cultural order, preserving a tradition, preserving a sense of sacredness. Even if they weren't particularly religious themselves, they had to preserve that sense of the sacred. And what happened in the 1940s and 50s is that conservatism got defined as what used to be called liberal. In other words, the free market is everything, individual is everything, forget family, forget everything, essentially. But the marketplace and the defense of the nation, because the old liberals were also like colonialists, and the people who called themselves liberals were in fact socialists, or worse, And what was somebody with something like a conservative worldview going to do? There was no place. There was no label. There was no party. There was no movement. And it's like conservative environmentalists today. The greatest environmental thinker, the most powerful philosopher of conservation today is Wendell Berry, who is a conservative. He lives off in his little farm in rural Kentucky. He writes these books about how managing his own little family farm. He's a Christian. He's a traditionalist, but he's on the board of the Sierra Club. Why? Because there's no conservative organization that would welcome Wendell Berry. They think he's the devil incarnate. And that in a nutshell is the failure of American conservatism. Not to make a place for the real social and cultural and moral conservatives who have surfaced.
All right. Are you a Wendell Berry fan, Pascal?
I don't know much about Berry. I'm very honest with you.
So let's see if Professor McManus is familiar with Wendell Berry. Of all the shitty stuff that he has to read, probably more so than even Ben Burgess when it comes like all this right-wing shit that McManus reads for these books. Let's see if he knows Wendell Berry. And coming at us all the way live from somewhere in Canada, much like Cuba, he's hiding as well. He is the Professor Matt McManus.
What's up, guys?
You're not hiding like Cuba is, actually. We could say where you are.
No, I'm just doing my best to stay warm because it's Canada, so it's November and we're already gonna get snow any day now, right?
Incredible. Well, welcome to the show, Matt. Thank you so much for being able to come on. Jason,
Yeah, it's great to be here again.
Jason, you want to start off with some of your questions? Or
Go ahead, because my Wi-Fi just went out. So go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So, Matt, in reading your book, I think the best place to start is, can you give us the distinction as well as the history of where liberalism starts as a political philosophy in terms of its actual kind of orthodox concept logically, as opposed to how it's evolved into a faction of, the kind of binary left-right, but the actual origins of liberalism, as your book illustrates, going back to the Enlightenment. Can you give that timeline for us and for our audience, please?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of different factors that led to the emergence of liberalism as a political philosophy, and liberalism has a lot of different meanings outside of political philosophy. You can think about the emergence of the Protestant Revolution, the rise of capitalism, particularly in the Hellenistic League and in the Dutch Republic. You can think about a lot of the revolutions for religious toleration that happened. But really at the epicenter of liberal philosophy as it starts to become formulated in the 17th century in the writings of people like Grotius and then Locke is this idea that people start out as moral equals, right? And this is something that's really important to stress because this is actually quite innovative and really radical and emancipatory, at least at the start, right? Because historically, political philosophers insisted that people aren't moral equals, right? Going back to somebody like Aristotle, there's this insistence that people are actually fundamentally unequal, and in fact, that some people are natural slaves, as he put it. Locke and Hobbes and Grotius would have none of that. Now, that doesn't mean that liberals thought that we wound up equal, and we'll get into all the different justifications they have for material and political inequality, and even justifying things like imperialism and slavery all over again, because of course, you can't have liberalism without a really ugly side. But that's, the epicenter of it, this idea that people are moral equals. And the flip side to that is that if people are moral equals, then there's something wrong about the state interfering with your life to tell you what it is that you're supposed to do. The notion of moral equality leads to another notion about the importance of liberty, because as individuals, we should all be left free to do what it is that we want without interference by others.
Can you talk for our audience about how the role of liberalism, this philosophy of increased freedom and escape from tyranny, also correlates with the move towards secular humanism and getting away from religious authority or theocratic, or if you will, the Roman state or the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, which was part of the governance structures under the monarchies that existed before liberalism develops.
And
Sure.
I want to add, would you say this happens kind of in this? Are you talking about the shift from like at the end of that video, Pascal, where the guy is talking about how the modern liberal sounds a little more conservative? Are you talking about that shift? Are you talking about just the history?
No, I'm talking about the shift from when we went from like religious-based monarchies that had the divine right of kings, and how part of liberalism comes out of trying to evolve from that and create a secular humanistic state.
Gotcha.
Can you touch on that a little bit for us, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually one of the points where we can also start talking about the difference between liberals and conservatives. Conservatives in the aftermath of a lot of these liberal revolutions really believe, first off, that human beings are fundamentally unequal, at least to begin with. And also that one of the important ways that you establish inequality, the proper forms of inequality, is by insisting that people not question authority. So you could say that they essentially legitimate power through sublimating it as authority. Early liberals really questioned that by saying, no, we should be free to attack things like the authority of kings, monarchs, the aristocrats. We should be free to criticize things like religious traditionalism and the authority of the church. And for a time, this was an extraordinarily emancipatory development, at least for some people, right? And it's worth noting it was conceived as such, even by people who became far more radical than many liberals, like Karl Marx, right? If you read the Communist Manifesto, he and Engels praised the bourgeoisie as the most radical and revolutionary class that has ever existed. And I think there's good reasons for that.
Okay, well, you're moving into the critique of between Marx and liberalism. Now, can you explain the way Hobbes fits into this evolution? The philosopher Hobbes you talk about in your book, in terms of being a foundational kind of key in developing ideas of liberalism.
Sure. Well, Hobbes is sometimes called the greatest English-speaking philosopher. I don't know if that's true, but he's definitely up there, right? He's not quite a liberal, but definitely an important proto-liberal thinker, writing in the aftermath of the English Civil War. And he's really responding to the arguments of people on all sides of the political spectrum, those who argue that people are fundamentally unequal, and so we should have a monarchical system that operates rather like a patriarchy, right? And people like the levelers who say that we should have a much more equal and democratic system even than what he was comfortable with. And the argument he makes in his book is quite radical in some respects and quite conservative in others. It's quite interesting that way, because he says it's absolutely the case that people are fundamentally equal in the state of nature. And in fact, he goes out of his way to stress this time and time again, where he says, I don't just mean morally equal in the sight of God. I mean, people are more or less equal in terms of their physical capacities, and they're even more equal in terms of their mental capacities, which is really an extraordinary admission, right? And from this, he says, well, we all start from this position of equality, but that can be really problematic because we share so much in common and have similar levels of power. We're equally able to hurt each other in the state of nature because there's no force that can compel us to refrain from taking from others what we think should be ours, and vice versa, right? Which is why we should establish something like what he calls the Leviathan, the absolute estate that will then maintain a system of law and order, which will allow us to pursue our self-interest without the danger of the war of all against all, as he called it, right? And so that's where the more conservative side of Hobbes comes in, this idea that we start with equality, but we need law and order eventually to emerge from these preconditions in order to actually get us what we want, which is peace, order, stability, capital.
Can you talk about how the development of liberalism coming out of a kind of critique of theocratic monarchies that existed in Europe also coincides with the development and the rise of mercantile capitalism as well, and how liberalism helps facilitate the development of mercantile capitalism as well? You can elaborate on that if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. And, I'm enough of a Marxist to say that in many respects, early liberals, particularly classical liberals, played a major role in providing ideological support for the emerging capitalist order, right? You can see this in a lot of their different works. And if your readers or listeners, force of habit, are interested, I'd really recommend a great book by a Canadian political theorist called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, Hobbes to Locke, which accounts for this brilliantly, very inspired by Marx. But really, you can see this best embodied in the figure of somebody like Locke, who's usually taken as kind of intellectual forefather of the American Revolution, not coincidentally, because Locke starts from similar premises as Hobbes, saying people in the state of nature are fundamentally equal, but he says that Hobbes is wrong to assume that in the state of nature we're animalistic, we're driven exclusively by self-interest and violent. Right? He says, actually, in the state of nature, we look kind of like miniature capitalists. We're entrepreneurs, right? And one of the ways in that we're entrepreneurial is that we labor And by mixing our labor with the land, we create property entitlements to that, right? This is sometimes called the labor theory of property entitlements, or just the labor theory of entitlements, right? Our properties, excuse me. And what Locke argues is that in this kind of condition, we gradually accumulate certain levels of private property through our labor, but it's not particularly well conserved or safe in the state of nature, because we still run into this problem that you could accumulate a lot of property, make your farm, and then somebody else can come along and take it from you. So what we need is the state to emerge in order to protect our natural rights, in particular, our right to property, right? And this has very clear capitalist connotations. A lot of the stuff that you see even American classical liberals and conservatives invoking today, things like this notion that hard work will get you ahead, that you have a right to keep what you so-called have earned, right, finds its root in the thinking of somebody like John Locke.
Right. So there is definitely not only a correlation, maybe some almost causational relationship with the rise of modern liberal or philosophical liberalism and the development of capitalism coming out of the monarchical theological period. So here's the question I want to ask you. With the rise of Marx being his work initially being a reaction to Hegelian philosophy, would you consider Marx within the liberal humanist tradition, or is he a corrective of that tradition? How would you categorize Marx philosophically relative to does he come out of that tradition? Is he reacting to it? Does he have an alternative argument? How would you categorize it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's a really big question, so I'm only going to be able to partly answer it here. I think the answer is kind of a little of column A and a little of column B, right? A good friend of mine, Igor Shukhabrod, wrote a really good book about this, by the way, called Revisiting Marx's Critique of Liberalism. I wrote a review of it for Jacobin if people are interested in checking it out, because Igor's great. He gives a really good account of this. But long story short, Marx started his career undoubtedly as a kind of radical liberal, right? In the Prussian state, he was engaged in arguing for political rights for previously disenfranchised groups. He agitated for freedom of the press, which you'd expect. You know, he was a newspaper guy initially, often faced censorship and exile because of the expression of his opinions, but gradually came to the opinion that liberalism didn't go far enough because while the liberal state was undoubtedly a huge fucking improvement over the autocracies that existed before, just in every possible respect, it didn't actually eliminate a politics of domination in the way that many liberals claimed it did, because in some senses what you'd seen was the replacement of aristocratic domination with domination by capital. And in fact, he says, what's remarkable about the liberal capitalist state is the fact that precisely because it's so productive and so technologically dynamic, its capacity to dominate the world is far, far greater than any of the old aristocratic or monarchical societies of old, which is precisely why you see so many of these countries engaging in vast imperialist and colonial projects. So he takes a very dialectical approach to his analysis of liberalism. On the one hand, there's no doubt that it's the most emancipatory force in his mind that's ever existed thus far, ideologically and materially. On the other hand, it's also a system that promotes domination on a scale hitherto unseen. And one of the things that we need to do as good Marxists is to try to appreciate the tensions within this dialectic without privileging one side or another, which is, of course, a really, really hard thing to do. But it's the task for us.
Does he eventually evolve to a position where he abandons his support of the liberal project?
Well, that's another really good question. And again, I'd suggest that people take a look at Igor's book or some of my writings on this. I have a new piece coming out on it not too long. I think that he abandons elements of the liberal project, right? But what he sometimes does in abandoning them is demonstrates why it is that certain ideological concepts developed by liberals ultimately can't be vindicated in the context of a liberal capitalist state. So take a really ingenious argument he gives about the labor theory of value, right? So he builds upon this Lockean idea that if you mix your labor with the matter of the world, you own it, right? To say, well, if you actually really believe that, who's the one that pours the stuff that creates your lattes, who's the ones that flip your burgers, who's the one that picks your crops, who's the one that sews your shirts. It's not the capitalists that are doing that, right? The ones who are mixing their labor with the matter of the world are the workers. So bourgeois society has this deep inconsistency implicit within its ideological framework, since they argue on the one hand that labor is the foundation of property entitlements, and later on they argue that it's the foundation of value as well, but they don't actually want to give the people who do most of the work and create most of the value what they're entitled to, right? And he felt that in a socialist state that might eventually replace the bourgeois order, what's going to happen is people will actually receive the value of what it is that they created, at least initially, as part of the transition to communism. But as a lot of people know, he didn't really say very much about how this was going to be carried out or what a post-bourgeois state was going to look like, right? There are a couple of interesting remarks in the Critique of the Gotha program, a handful of comments in, Das Kapitals, volume 1 to 3. But if you were to add up all the stuff he wrote about what a socialist society would look like, how it would differ from liberalism, what it would keep from liberalism, it'd probably amount to 2 or 3 pages. But I do think that the proper dialectical way to approach this question, and I point this out in my essay, is to recognize that any society that comes into being that's far more just and far more equal than we have right now is still going to be, as he put it in the Critique of the Gotha program, stamped with features of the old one. And I think we meant by that any socialist society, like I would like to see that's going to come, will have features of liberalism, both as historical remnants and because the institutions that many liberals created might be useful or just. But it's also going to go beyond liberalism in some very, very important ways. Although, again, how always was a little bit ambiguous for Marx.
Would you consider your model then to be what is now known as social democracy?
I wouldn't say so, no. The reason being, I characterize myself as kind of a liberal socialist, right? If you think about my 2 big theoretical influences, it'd be somebody, 3. There'd be somebody like Cornel West, and then there would be Karl Marx, and then probably somebody like John Rawls, right? The reason I call myself a liberal socialist is I believe that the kind of just institutions that we should have in society would be ones that reflected a lot of the classical liberal rights to expression, rights to freedom of religion, rights to association, all the stuff that I imagine many of your listeners probably would have no problem with, right? But I would have a far less grand commitment to property than what many of the classical liberals do, because I don't think that rights to private property should be nearly as expansive as what you see in the classical liberal tradition. I would argue for something like an entitlement to personal property, right? You have your house and I have my house. So the state shouldn't just be allowed to come in and take it from you. But when it comes to things like the means of production, I think those should be organized democratically. What form that democracy should take, I think that something like the Mondragon Corporation in Spain is a good example. But I see this as kind of the first step on the road to higher levels of socialization that should take place over time. I kind of with Bhaskar Sankara in his book, The Socialist Manifesto, where the kind of liberal socialism that I'm arguing for is supposed to look like what we want 5 minutes after capitalism, as he put it.
Basically cooperatives.
Yeah, very similar.
The transitional phase, I guess you would say.
Yeah, exactly.
When capitalism collapsed in our perfect Marxist socialist utopian fantasies.
And we all drink lemonade from the sea, right?
I did want to ask you. You mentioned in your book early on that there has been a big shift, and of course we see it here in left media as well, a big shift to accept things like socialism. We're all a little older. I know Pascal and I are even older than you, man. And we remember a time when socialist was just a bad word. Communist, definitely a bad word. I grew up watching all those wonderful Cold War movies. Rocky IV, Red Dawn. What is this shift that we are seeing with the younger millennial generation to be so accepting of socialist ideals in a moment where they're coming off of, kind of as Adam Curtis calls it, the century of the self?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of answers to that that I've discussed in couple of my books, and there are people who can speak to this a lot more eloquently than I can. In terms of my own radicalization, I I grew up in the middle of the Great Recession. So when people used to tell me that this is the best possible, kind of society that we can have, or the best possible economic form, my response was, with all due respect, I think that's bullshit, right? If this is the best we can possibly do, it's not nearly good enough, right? And I think that you're seeing a lot of the new generation coming after us, millennials, also feeling very similarly, since Gen Z is growing up in a period of neoliberalization and economic precarity as well. Some of it brought about by the pandemic, a lot of it brought about by the collapse of the moderate social democratic states that's now been carried out for 40 years, right? And I think that a lot of this makes an alternative very, very appealing to many of us. And I think the reason why it is that socialism has proven so appealing is partly because of, the historical grandeur associated with the word, but also because in the 21st century, there's been a lot more opportunity to actually look at what a lot of the major socialist movements around the globe accomplished. You think about things like organizing the labor movement, pushing for workers' rights, pushing for a shortening of the workers' day. The reason most of us think about the 8-hour working day right now as just being the norm, maybe not under neoliberalism, but once upon a time, right, is because many socialist movements pushed and fought and died precisely for that, right? And you can also look at all the accomplishments of many of the democratic socialist parties in Europe, where they instituted some of the most robustly equal and prosperous societies in the world. Did they go far enough? I don't think so. The kind of society that I'd want to see would be something like Sweden or Denmark on steroids. But you build upon those models and you try to build upon their lessons. But you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and say that, yes, there's no point in actually learning from what worked, right?
Pascal is itching to ask something. I see the follow-up in your eyes, brother.
No, my position is that, when we say, Sweden, Denmark, these are countries that are still part of, the global capitalist order. They still, have market exchanges. They still, I know Sweden doesn't take official stances on imperialism, but they are still protected by, the NATO alliance. How exactly would we try to create our ideal society in the fact that we still have an empire called the U.S., or several empires? You can say China, you may say Russia as well. How exactly does our vision for a social economic model, or what you call liberal socialism, I still think it's kind of social democracy. Mm-hmm. How does that happen when we have these kind of global entanglements with major empires with nuclear weapons, military bases across all over the world?
And I have to add, Matt, I have to add that if you're mowing anybody in your vision, Pascal's always going to call you a sock dip.
That's fair. No, don't worry. I've been called far worse things. Admittedly, by far less fine people, also. But it's a great question, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this myself. One of the answers that I usually give is that the problem, as I see it, with what you could call Scandinavian social democracy, is that while there was a major effort made to redistribute the kind of surplus produced by capital, including capital accruing for fossil fuels in the mineral extraction industries or whatever, there was comparatively few efforts to try to democratize the workplace to the extent that would be necessary. And this is actually a really interesting history, because in the 1970s, there really was an effort by the social democratic parties in Sweden to actually push for a full democratization of capital. And that was the line that many of these large corporate execs finally drew and said, we're not going to have any more of that. We're happy to pay high levels of taxes to try to pay for these big social welfare programs, but we get to maintain control of our major industries, right? And many of the social democratic parties and activist movements back down after that, and you've seen the corrosion of Swedish social democracy ever since then. Not to the same degree that you see in other countries, whether you're talking about France or Britain or Canada, but still an erosion, right? And I think this really testifies to one of the mistakes that a lot of the early soc dems made, right? Which is this belief that you can create this kind of balance between the power of capital and the power of labor, let the capitalists maintain control of the industries, and then just encourage them to redistribute the surplus to provide all these goods. I don't think that that's ever going to work. What you need is a real redistribution, not just of resources, but of real political power to the workers. And I think the way to try to do that is through economic democracy, as it's sometimes called. Worker cooperatives, rebuilding trade unions, breaking up large monopolistic firms, ending the influence of money in liberal democracies. There's a whole litany of policies that I think are going to be necessary if we're going to pursue the kind of objectives of social democracy, but not fall into the same traps that it did in the 1970s.
How do you deal with the potential trap of state capitalism, if you, or becoming a state capitalist kind of economic model?
Yeah, well, I think that that's a huge worry. And I think that when it comes to trying to pitch democratic socialism to many people, it's not just a theoretical concern, because that's the number one thing that they're anxious about, right? That what we're going to see is something like the atavism of the Soviet Union or Maoist China. And nobody wants that. And I think there are good reasons for them not to want that, right? The way that I think that we try to avoid that is by not putting the state in charge in the way that you saw in the Soviet system, but by genuinely democratizing the workplaces of people initially as a further step towards granting them not just a capacity to redistribute resources in a way that would be more useful for them, but also giving them more political and economic power, both in the workplace and at the state level, right? And is that a sufficient step? No. I think the other things that you need to do, again, are trying to drastically reduce the influence of money in politics. And sadly, we've been going in the other directions, both in the United States and elsewhere, for a very long time now. Citizens United in 2010 was just kind of the capstone on a long history that's been going on since the 1980s. You also need to try to rebuild other kinds of activist groups for women, activist groups for people of color, activist groups for LGBTQ people that can kind of serve as a permanent source of political strength for the broader political left. And I'm not sure which one of these we should prioritize. I think that we need to do a little bit of all of them at the same time.
Well, contrary to what you might believe, and Jason as well, I'm not totally hostile to your intermediary cooperative stage. Because actually, I'm going to propose to you a model. This is what I would consider my model of an economic model. Mm-hmm. Now, we know we have a free market economy. We have companies that sell shares. We have workers. We have laborers. We have a general population. And we have a government. Why don't we set up a situation where we have all publicly traded companies that issue shares are divided into three parts. 1/3 of shares are owned by all members of society. All citizens combined get 1/3 of every publicly traded company. 1/3 goes to the creators or the private owners who started that business enterprise. 1/3 is for the state, which will remove the need for taxes. Okay? At the same time, we only do that with businesses that have over $5 million a year in revenue, so you do not stop the development of small business. And the next kicker that I would add is that we remove interest-based lending and have an equity-based lending system, because interest will allow the parasitic relationship of the banking system to continue to regenerate wealth without contributing to society.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely sounds like an interesting prospect. Can you give me any examples of where something like that's been tried?
Well, I think the Mondragon, I mean, it's never been tried anywhere completely, particularly with the equity-based banking and removing interest. But I think the Mondragon situation is an interesting paradigm where you have a kind of like worker-based cooperative model. But the model I'm offering gives actual worker control of the means of productions and resources. And not only that, all of the citizens of society as well, and voting shares in terms of how businesses are developed. So it's just a more expansive vision of a cooperative model. You still have a democratically elected government, and since the government receives 1/3 of all the actual private sector businesses, I would also think all public national resources, state resources, they'd be state-owned. No private ownership of oil or water reservoirs. That would all be state-owned. And the revenue will be also go to the state and redistributed to the members of society. of course, I don't have a proof of concept for this model, but what do you think about it as a model economy? Though it still allows for small business development, but also creates a situation where every citizen receives revenue from all business endeavors that are over $5 million a year.
Yeah, I definitely like the sound of it provisionally. And I should say, I kind of sketched out a little model for economic democracy of my own in my most recent piece for Jacobin, inspired by the work of Robert Dahl. And it looks something like that, right? There was this idea that you would have workplace democracy where owners would actually govern the workplace, but a certain share of whatever it is that they produce would go to the state, which would use it to provide public services. Right? And it sounds to me like that might actually be a tangible way to go about achieving something like that, while restructuring the power relations between capital, the state, and workers. Right now, the only problem that I would have is that when we start getting into the nitty-gritty specifics of what it is that we're going to do, I think we also have to be really careful to avoid two dilemmas. The first one is the one that you brought up, which is that you don't want to infringe on the little guy who might just want to be setting up a small business for him or herself and their family by entangling them in this kind of web of regulations and difficulties, right? Like most socialists, I would say the people that we're going after are the Teslas and Microsofts of the world, not the little girl who's selling lemonade down the street. You know what I mean? Which is, conservatives sometimes pick us for. The second thing that I'm just keen on is making sure that we're culturally sensitive to the way that some of these changes are implemented. And the reason I bring this up is coming to Canada. We're a white settler nation that has a long history of perpetrating genocide against Indigenous peoples of the land. Many Indigenous communes and tribes in the area have responded by setting up private businesses that are insulated from various forms of state taxation and state pressure. The reason being that they want to obtain a certain level of independence for themselves relative to the Canadian state.
Can you give an example of what that looks like?
In a Canadian context?
Please. Yes,
yeah,
please.
There's a lot of different ones, and it would really depend on which tribe that you're looking at, right? Some of the ones, for instance, in the very north of the country, claim possession of some of the mineral and material resources that are on their land. And their argument is that it can only be developed, included by external countries, if most of the surplus goes to the tribe, right? Or most of what's produced goes to the tribe, right? Others will do similar things to what you see in the United States, which is to invest in things like building casinos or invest in things like producing cigarettes, right? That they can sell without having to pay taxes or manage without government regulations. And they bring in people from outside who will use these things, and the tribe can make a profit off of that, right? Now, I'm not saying that all these things are necessarily good or bad, and there's issues with corruption that appear in there like everywhere, right? But I do think that in some contexts, it's important to even look at some businesses that reach above that $5 million threshold and try to be sensitive to the fact that in some of these circumstances, it might be useful to allow them a certain level of independence from state intrusion just for historical reasons, right? But that's neither here nor there. In general, I really like the way your idea is going. I'd have to hear a little bit more about it. And, if you could spell it out for me, then that'd be helpful. But I'd say I'm 80% of the way there. Why don't we say that?
I do want to address this super chat question to the panel. Any thoughts on Yanis Varoufakis's recent comments on the state of liberalism, capitalism, and what he asserts is the emergence of techno feudalism?
Some fascinating stuff. I saw a little bit of a video when he talks about that. It's he believes that we are at a stage of capitalism that he calls now techno feudalism, where ownership. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I was thinking. I mean, fucking when we saw all the billionaires go up in their rocket ships. I mean, what else could we think of? But let them eat cake, on a mass scale, right? And it's just like all the rest of us get to live on Earth with COVID and recession and neoliberalism and ongoing anxieties fostered by the political right about whether you should even have a vaccine or whatever. And up they go on their big ass fucking rocket ships, telling us, you made this happen, guys. Thanks so much. Right.
And I do want to add that as I was driving down to make this move, the news was talking about a large protest in Los Angeles that I was very shocked that some decent sized rappers were at actually about the mask mandate that came down in LA that said that you're going to have to show proof to go into certain bars and restaurants that you are vaccinated. And even there was police officers and firemen and some other state employees that were part of this protest because they didn't want the government infringing on their rights. And that gets me into this next question I have for you as we're getting closer to the end of the hour, which is, can you get into the weeds of the difference between the quote unquote classic liberal, like people like Dave Rubin, and and let's just be honest, if you guys, and I know you probably weren't listening to California Public Radio yesterday, as I was on that drive, but I was shocked at what I was hearing from the man on the ground interviews, from people that just kept talking about an infringement on their rights with a vaccine mandate, when you have to be vaccinated to go to public school in California, and it's been that way ever since I was a child. I'm sure it was the same for you as well, right, Pascal?
I'm sure it was. In New York, come on, man, blue state, you know what's up.
So it's been interesting hearing all these talks about freedom and liberty, and we look at these people as conservatives. So can you give us a definition of what a modern conservative is?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's characteristic of conservatives that make them different from liberals and socialists, right, is liberals tend to believe that people are moral equals from the beginning, but they become unequal over time because of their own efforts. Now, left-wing liberals are a little bit more critical of that, and sometimes very critical of that. People I like John Rawls, right? But they are committed to this idea of moral equality. Socialists are very committed to this idea of moral equality, and they also tend to believe that that should instantiate itself very robustly in terms of material equality and political equality, whether through democratization of the workplace or whatever, right? Conservatives from the very beginning have insisted that people are not moral equals, that there are some people who are simply better than others, and people who are better are the ones who should be empowered to rule or to govern, right? And you can see this reflected in some of the conservatives who claim to be classical liberals, right? Because in a certain sense, they are, in the fact that they're stressing a commitment to a certain kind of freedom. But we always find with people like Dave Rubin, or for instance, with the People's Party of Canada in the United States, is when they talk about the importance of freedom, it's always freedom for certain groups that they deem worthy and right, are capable of exercising agency effectively, right? And they're unwilling to grant those kind of entitlements to other people that they deem unworthy. And a genuine liberal wouldn't make those kind of discriminations, or at least they shouldn't, right? And it sometimes can get tricky because there are right-wing variants of liberalism, for instance, the ones espoused by people like F.A. Hayek, that get very close to this argument that some people are more entitled to higher levels of political agency and power than others because they are better, but never quite cross that line. Many American conservatives do, and they just appropriate the language of liberalism to try to legitimate what is fundamentally a very illiberal kind of project.
So
would you? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pascal.
No, go ahead.
No.
You're on a tear.
No. You go.
Okay. So would you say? Can you explain this? Because this is very important. Because I've rarely heard someone explain this. Can you explain how libertarianism fits into the conservative project, and why libertarianism, which premises itself on the argument that it's actually freeing you from the fetters of government, actually increases oppressive hierarchy as opposed to actually working as a liberating tool?
And when does this shift happen? I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Adam Curtis, but he has an interesting documentary series called Century of the Self, where he gets into this shift in the 60s where we're starting to see this happen. And I don't remember him actually saying terms like libertarian and conservative because it was more about advertising. But to me, that's what I'm seeing here, where what we call a conservative just looks a little different because they are calling for a freedom of something, and generally it's the freedom of the market.
Sure, absolutely. And this is a very interesting question. And it's one that's pretty distinctive to the United States because while there are other self-identified libertarian movements elsewhere, it doesn't have the same kind of currency anywhere else, right? But just kind of looking back a little bit, we should divide libertarianism into two, right? There are earlier anarchist movements mainly that claim kind of libertarian ethos for themselves. Many of these emerged during the 19th century, and I don't think we should have any problem with those, right? Generally speaking, the people who claim the libertarian name throughout the 19th century, people like William Godwin, tended to argue for the elimination of various forms of state power, high levels of equality between people, and could even be very critical of the way that emergent systems of capital were becoming parasitic upon the state and used it to try to entrench or further entrench the control of society. What we now see called libertarianism is very different from this, right? What you see a lot of libertarians argue, again, in a very conservative way, is that the market is, yes, an important mechanism for people to engage in free economic exchanges. And yes, it's also good because these kinds of free economic exchanges will, be to the betterment of society because it will produce a surplus of wealth and so on. But the fundamental reason to revere the market from this libertarian perspective, this is people like Murray Rothbard or Ayn Rand, is the market is essentially a competitive mechanism that allows the best and the worst to sort themselves and for the proper kind of social hierarchy to emerge, right? And in this respect, they're kind of like hyper-conservatives because they believe that the problem with the old aristocratic order is it allowed the unworthy to have too much power for too long because they weren't compelled to exercise it or to compete to maintain it for any long period of time. And people from the bottom who might be worthy aren't given the opportunity to rise up, right? If they have the strength to do so. Whereas in market society, what you have is a system where you rise or fall on your own merits, and the losers who wind up at the bottom are really losers who belong there, and the rarefied few who end up winning actually belong at the very top, and all the good things in the world should go to them. And I don't really think of this as libertarian in this classic sense at all. What this really is a kind of possessive individualist veneration of competitive market society that treats it as a sorting mechanism, and it's one of the most monstrous ideologies that's ever emerged. And it's had a catastrophic effect on the world, environmentally, socially, morally, and we'd be best off if we saw the back of it as quickly as possible.
Who are the ideological progenitors of the contemporary liberalism? I know Ayn Rand, but who can you go farther back as being the real mothers or fathers of this ideology?
Well, I think you can go back to somebody like John Locke as a kind of founding figure in many respects. I don't want to pick on him too much because there are a lot of radical and emancipatory dimensions to Locke's thought also, and he was a complex thinker. But really somebody like Herbert Spencer, I think, is where you see this doctrine first espoused in its purest form, right? Spencer started off by claiming to be a liberal, gradually moved towards the political right, and his argument was that we need to have a small state, not because he really believed that the most important thing is human freedom, but because a small state that allows the market to run without any inhibition will sort people into the ranks on the hierarchy where they actually belong. And he thought that this was better than any kind of hierarchical form of organization that existed before, because the problem with the old aristocracy is, you were born into it and you got to be hoity-toity and you didn't really have to do anything to earn your place. Whereas in market society, you have to be cutthroat, competitive, and beat everyone else out constantly, right? And it was also associated with this kind of meritocratic logic, which is that if you can outcompete everyone and wind up at the top of market society, you must genuinely be better, which, the inverse is if you wind up at the bottom, it might just because you're a loser and that's where you belong, right? And in many ways, this is a much more damaging kind of outlook than what you even saw with the old Ancien regime, because at least in the old kind of conservative orders, they would say things like, well, if you're a peasant, God placed you there. It's not because you did anything wrong. It's just because that's where you belong, right? Just like I belong with my ass on the throne. Whereas what you saw with people like Spencer or Ayn Rand is this argument that if I'm on the throne, that's because I deserve to be there because I worked hard for it. And if you're cleaning the floors at McDonald's, that's because that's where you belong, because you're a loser and that's the best that you could possibly hope for. And you should, in fact, be grateful that I created the McDonald's that you now work in, right? It's a much, much more noxious, narcissistic kind of outlook than what you even saw in earlier forms of conservatism.
Can you place Spencer in a particular time period for me? Who is he a contemporary of? Spencer.
Mid-19th century, right around the same time period as John Stuart Mill and excuse me, John Stuart Mill, August Comte, Karl Marx, figures like that.
Interesting.
Actually, he's the individual who coined the term. He's often taken to be one of the founding figures of social Darwinism, right? And you can see that in kind of the description I gave, right? This notion that the market allows the survival of the fittest by allowing the best to rise and the worst to wind up working at the McDonald's where they belong. Right?
I want to say shout out to Patrick Leslie. Shout out to everybody that has given a super chat today. That actually goes a long way in the getting Baby Bajlan a gift from the show fund and Mom's birthday fund and keeping the Wi-Fi going internationally fund. So we definitely appreciate that. And Matt, I don't know if you saw in the chat, friend of show, friend in real life, the Ben Burgess is watching and commenting as well.
Yeah. By the way, I just finished reading Ben's book today on Christopher Hitchens, and I'd be remiss if I didn't do a big plug for it. Really enjoyed it. Complicated guy, great drinker, great smoker, and if people get a chance, I'd strongly recommend checking it out. It's a lot of fun, and you'll learn a lot.
Check out our show on Christopher Hitchens also. We had a great show with Ben talking about him.
And so was the after hours on that. I think we went an extra like hour and a half in the after hours after Ben had said that. And I want to add this to Ben. He had just had his booster shot and he was hella tired and went an extra hour and a half after he told us he was going to give us 20 minutes in the bonus patron after hours. So that was, and then me and him talked for another hour offline. So that's the equivalent of playing a football game with a broken limb.
I can tell you, when I was teaching in Mexico, Ben came to give a talk. He was a keynote speaker, actually. Coming to Toronto again, actually, so we're very excited about that also. But I had never met a man who could stay up as late and drink as effortlessly as him and still be so articulate, so nice. And I have to say, also sing karaoke so well, right?
Wow.
Yeah. I remember it reminded me of this joke Robin Williams once said where it was 4:00 in the morning and I was like, I gotta go home, I'm done. And he was just like, no, another hour, another half hour or so. I'm like, no, it's over. So great guy.
Speaking of Robin Williams, side note, there's a video floating around the internet of an actor that's trying to get a movie made about Robin Williams where he does an amazing Robin Williams impersonation of Robin Williams on the Mork and Mindy set, finding out that John Belushi had died after they were just partying all night the night before. Have you seen that clip?
No, I have not.
Blew my mind.
Did. Who was the actor in it? I remember seeing it.
I had never seen that cat before in my life. I had no idea who he was, but he nailed Robin Williams.
He did. I mean, I'm a big fan. Yeah, I grew up with Hook and all that stuff, and he always made me laugh. But yeah, I was just like, man, if you were to tell me that was like a young Robin Williams and I'd never seen anything more than some of his older movies, I'd be like, oh, 100%, you know?
Yeah, that dude had nailed Robin Williams, and it blew me away. So if he's going to get a movie made, good luck. But on a serious note, we are at the end of the hour, and if you are a patron, get ready because Matt said he's coming with us. Unlike last time when he flaked on us.
Just let me go grab a beer, okay, guys? I'll be right back.
He's gonna do his Burgess impersonation. Of course, we got time for you to grab a beer. Absolutely. So if you haven't done it, please hit like, please hit subscribe. We have a super chat to end the show. In the end, leftism is simply an ethical position, right? How does someone discuss with conservative / right libertarians when they fundamentally disagree on the ethics of human hierarchies? We are going to answer that question in the bonus half. Pascal, are you ready?
Yes. Don't forget to hit the bell when you hit subscribe. Hit the bell.
See, I didn't even remember to tell him to hit the bell. And that is why you're here, Pascal, for bell reminders.
Hopefully for more than that.
You're here for bell reminders. And you're kind of the TNA of the show. So, and on that note, good night.